Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Horner. I'm the Director of Education at Emory's Michael C. Carlos Museum, and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Over my long career at the Carlos Museum, one of my great joys has been the company and the collegiality of Dr. Bana Wescoat, who is Professor and Chair of Art History at Emory and also was the first faculty curator at the Carlos Museum. And over the years, we've had several conversations about how wonderful it would be to invite her brother, Jim Wescoat, to speak at the Carlos Museum. And I'm just thrilled that the Wondrous Worlds exhibition has made that long discussed opportunity a reality. And so it's my great pleasure in this time of Zoom, when Zoom is bringing families together, to have Zoom bring the Wescoat family together tonight. And Bana is going to introduce our speaker, and then I'll come back on at the end of the talk to field the Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A, and it's my great pleasure to turn the podium over to Bana Wescoat. Thank you so much, Bana.
Elizabeth, thank you. And let me assure you the feeling is mutual. We have all so admired and appreciated the educational programs you've brought to the many audiences of the Carlos Museum year after year. And we thank you immensely. And I thank you particularly for this evening's event, because it is such a great pleasure to have Jim join us. And although we still hope that it will sometimes be in the flesh, this Zoom opportunity is wonderful as well. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Jim Wescoat, who is one of the very, very few people I have known my entire life. This task is daunting, even for one who has followed his every footstep, because as the architect Yo Hung Chang remarked, he's an interdisciplinary world all to himself. Jim has worked on everything from water rights in Colorado to ancient Roman aqueducts and urban water and law design, to the legendary tunnels traveled by Sufi saints, which turned out to track pre-colonial road networks in Mughal Lahore. He is equally at home conducting a design critique, speaking about the economies of water and poverty in World Economic Forum, or serving on the commission to restore the gardens of the Taj Mahal. Jim's love of the subcontinent was sparked by a summer as an American Field Service student in India and Sri Lanka in the 1960s. The assignment was random, one didn't have the right to choose, but it proved prophetic. After taking a degree in landscape design and working as a landscape architect, he completed a PhD in geography focused on water use and conservation practice in Western Colorado. And he returned increasingly to the power of water in shaping human experience, which took him back to the historical water systems of 17th century Mughal gardens in India and Pakistan. His investigations have oscillated like a perfectly balanced pendulum between theory and practice, and they have led to him to take positions in the geography department of the University of Colorado at Boulder and the Department of Architecture at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, before he took the position of Aga Khan Professor of Landscape Architecture at MIT. His work has been intensely collaborative and inclusive. Annual winter trips to India and Pakistan always included MIT students. His research agenda could vary considerably, but it always was anchored by the touchstone of water. Water and pleasure, water and gardens, water and work, water and the economy, water and power, water and spiritual renewal. In short, water for life, which is the title of one of his many books. In 2018, he was elevated to the Council of Fellows, the highest honor of the American Society of Landscape Architects, for his contributions to knowledge. He received the Distinguished Member Award for his work in water conservation professional practice networking. Now, there's a backstory, of course, to all of this. One simply doesn't do such extraordinary things by being, well, a very average sort of person. Behind that oversized forehead, there was not only a very big brain, but also a highly mischievous personality. One with a devilish side to which his younger siblings can amply attest. He gave us all crazy nicknames that endure to this day. He played tricks that sometimes terrified us. I have been scarred for life by watching the horror film The Crawling Eye, which he watched over and over again one Sunday afternoon, sometime in 1958 or 59. Now, I could have left the room, but the aura of being with him was simply too strong. He drew us in like a magnet. Adulthood, meeting his life partner, Flory, and being joined by their daughter, Ruby, brought whole new joys. And there were acts of valor. You see him here in Rome when he was a fellow at the American Academy with Ruby and our sister-in-law, Hee Jung, and baby Ethan, his nephew. Just before Ethan's stroller took off as a runaway baby stroller careening down the Roman hillside, Jim lunged to the rescue, cracking a few ribs in the process. His magnetism continues to draw us. He's always the leader of the annual family journey to the museums of Washington on the Washington Mall. His athletic prowess, well, it stands right there with the rest of the Wescoats, aspirational. But his talents for choosing offbeat liquors that for Thanksgiving toast is, well, inspired. Also a little experimental. So as you listen to this evening's lecture, Water Heritage of Mughal Gardens and Landscapes in Kashmir, I invite you also to enjoy the person in whose slipstream I have traveled these many, many, many years. Jim.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you, Bonna. This is just extraordinary. And I have never had an introduction like this, and I'm grateful for it. Very grateful for it. I think you've captured my life, and I don't know exactly now what I should say as I kind of get ready to take you all on a trip to Mughal Kashmir. And well, I'll try to do justice to the introduction that you've given me, Bonna. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. And here we go. This talk on water heritage and the Mughal Gardens of Kashmir occurred, and it was being prepared during a water crisis in the valley. Not one of floods, not of droughts, but instead very low temperatures, minus 8+ degrees in Srinagar. And these cold temperatures disrupted river and lake transport. They froze water pipes, pumps, and taps. And even now, as the ice in Srinagar is melting, water heritage in the valley faces a variety of uncertainties. The catastrophic 2014 regional Jhelum River floods remain fresh in public memory. Water livelihoods on Dal Lake and throughout the valley struggle in the context of political conflict and also environmental concerns. There's deteriorating water quality that threatens public and environmental health. That's contributed to pressures to resettle lake gardeners and houseboats, notwithstanding their important contributions to water heritage. At the site scale, Mughal Garden waterworks continue to delight families, no doubt, but they're facing challenges on how to be conserved and maintained properly, as we'll see. And long-term concerns about climate change loom large at every scale. It's in this highly dynamic and challenging context that 6 Mughal gardens with impressive waterworks are being considered for UNESCO's World Heritage List. The 6 gardens are exemplars of a larger tradition of Mughal gardens in Kashmir, which the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, J&K chapter, has documented, and colleagues like Jan Emeritus have been studying closely. Hundreds of gardens lined the valley's lakes and rivers. They had prominent water axes, but were also linked to large water bodies, as shown here. They belonged to a much larger geography of sacred waterfalls, springs, and streams that were associated with water spirits, nagas, rituals, tirthas, and saints, rishis, and sufis. So the first point that I'd like to underscore concerns the centrality of water within and far beyond the Mughal water garden walls in Kashmir. Consider this pair of paintings depicting the fourth Mughal ruler Jahangir in two water scenes. On the left, he explores a large lake by boat, perhaps Wular Lake in Kashmir, observing an island like the famous island palace of a 15th century Sultan Zain al-Abidin, shown in the middle ground of the painting, with snow-capped Himalayan mountains beyond. On the right, Jahangir holds court from a low white marble throne situated above a cascading water channel, and the water flows from a white pavilion through the terraced hill slope garden. The former scene provided access to the latter, as Mughal rulers often traveled by boat to observe and reach the their garden enclosures. The white pavilion resembles the snow-capped mountain peaks whose meltwaters produce streams, cascades, and pools. And thus, these Mughal garden waterworks in Kashmir compressed the valued geographical sequence of waterfalls, springs, streams, and tanks, and simultaneously miniaturized them in monumental ways within the garden walls. Now, in these key respects, the water respects, the Mughal waterworks in Kashmir differ dramatically from earlier Mughal gardens, both in Central Asia and on the North Indian plains. The Central Asian gardens, like the one depicted in the painting on the left of the first Mughal ruler, Babur, who's improving a stream in the Garden of Istalif in Afghanistan. That garden had sloping terrain, but many of those gardens in the region of Central Asia lacked large perennial water flows. The map in the middle plots Babur's many references to water during the conquest of India between 1527 and 1530. Every arrow points to a water event or observation. He did not go to Kashmir, which is indicated by the green square. These early water projects should be stressed were both political and territorial as well as aesthetic acts. Babur's gardens on the plains, like the Bagi Nilufar or Lotus Garden in Dolpur, shown on the far right, lacked both the terrain and the abundant water supply that were present in Kashmir, but nevertheless had a real elegance and beauty. Even the monumental early Mughal gardens, like Humayun's Tomb Garden in Delhi, had visually powerful but architecturally small water features. Kashmir was different. And if there's any doubt about the primacy of water in the gardens and larger environment of Kashmir, consider this late 19th century embroidered shawl map. I mean, this is an enormous shawl um, and of the city of Srinagar and environments. It postdates the Mughal period by about 2 centuries, but one can see in the details on the right um, detailed plan and elevation views of specific gardens. This one is labeled here in Urdu, Bagi Shalimar, and also the river life with boating parties and aquatic life filling the waterways. And one could do a whole talk on the complex representational story and context of these shawls and painted cloth maps of similar size and date. But this is just illustrative of the uh, waters of Kashmir. And instead, we need to even scale out further to appreciate the distribution of Mughal gardens within the valley, which are shown on this Google Earth image. It makes it clear how the Valley of Kashmir lies between the Himalayan range to the north and east and the Pir Panjal range to the south and west. The river Jhelum, as it's known today, drains the valley, flowing from southeast to northwest through a long depositional landscape. And with this introduction to the distribution of Mughal gardens and the within the water system of Kashmir, let's just turn for a moment to the topic of water heritage and its conservation, what they mean. Many disciplines are involved, from historians to hydrologists, aquatic ecologists to cultural ecologists, conservation architects and landscape architects. And I use this diagram to describe four main water conservation foci of research and practice. The images on the right correspond with the numbers in each of the cells of the Venn diagram on the left. And it comes from studies that we did in Rajasthan on water conserving design there. One topic is the conservation of the physical water works themselves, channels, pools, and fountains. Secondly, though, is the conservation of the water resources, both in terms of their volumes as well as their quality. Third, the conservation of water experience. How are these places um, experienced, perceived, and regarded, valued? And then a fourth, and increasingly emphasize the conservation of water-related livelihoods. Encompassing all of these for what I'll call this historical geographic context and approach to this type of study, where you're telling a story of how they interact with one another through space and time. And at the intersection of all of them is the practice of conservation design, where the various parties involved are generating alternatives that take all of these different sorts of knowledge into account to generate integrative ideas and options to be considered and acted upon as appropriate. So this looks very orderly as a way of thinking about water heritage conservation, but the sources that we study, the texts, the paintings, the maps, and site surveys, in tonight's case, often leap from one topic to another, from one place or spatial scale to another. Just as the mind proceeds in such unpredictable ways when thinking about water heritage and flows from one water topic to another, not always smoothly, some ways that might seem turbulent or even turbid. Now, some pre-Mughal Kashmiri texts, like the Rajatarangani, the River of Kings, convey these complex dynamics of history beautifully. And tonight I'd like to try a narrative experiment with you all. It's the central thread of the talk is going to be retracing the historical and geographical references to water and water gardens in Kashmir that are recorded in Mughal chronicles. That's the central line of the story. But when these sources mention a topic that involves a conservation problem, I'll try to briefly step out of the historical narrative to address it, sometimes using current water research methods, and then return to the historical path to continue the story. Let's see how this experiment works. Let's start with the pre-conquest Mughal perceptions of the waters of Kashmir. I was surprised when preparing this paper to find that 150 years before the Mughal conquest of Kashmir, they and their ancestors, beginning with the Central Asian ruler Timur, wrote about the valley of Kashmir, never having seen it. Now this multi-generational dynasty, a little bit like some of Bana's pictures of our family, include all of the cast of characters from Timur down to the current Mughal rulers. So they weren't contemporary with one another, but they're all assembled in this wonderful garden scene, which was a context that they valued highly for all kinds of symbolic, functional, and aesthetic reasons. And the authors, these kind of dynastic leaders from Timur beginning with Timur, uh, praised the qualities of Kashmir and mentioned that it was drained by a large river that today we call the Jhelum. They reported that the river originated in a large lake called Virnak. And that's not hydrologically correct, but we'll see that that is for many very deep cultural reasons, a strongly held view of the river. From that origin at Virnag, the river flowed through the capital city of Srinagar, which was flanked by impressive dwellings and bridges. From Kashmir, they noted that the river discharged, and the river at this point is discharging into the plains of Punjab, ultimately joining the Indus River and flowing out into the Arabian Sea, as indicated on this really extraordinary Mughal map on the right, which provides this comprehensive geographic perception of the Jhelum and the Indus river basin. It's really one of the earliest that I'm aware of a river basin map from source to sink. Um, that account of the river and its origins in Kashmir is repeated in all of the major biographies and memoirs of the 15th and 16th centuries, leading up to the Mughal conquest in 1586. Now, references to water and Kashmiri histories of the same period emphasized the river within the valley and also some of its strategic river crossings, sacred places, bridge building and bridge being destroyed by rival armies. Those historical texts, um, in both cases, Mughal and Kashmiri, interestingly drew upon older religious texts like the Nilamata Purana, which emphasized the sacred places and rituals in the river valley, the tributaries and countless springs and Naga spirits. Um, all of these sources, historical and sacred, speak of the river and pool of Virnag as the origin of the river. As I mentioned, consistent in historical terms, though not hydrologic terms. Okay, so 1586, after several years of deliberation in 1586, the third Mughal ruler, Akbar, shown in a painting on the right, sent an armed force from Lahore to invade Kashmir. And a Kashmiri account gave a stark picture of the Mughal army's march up to the mountain pass. It was not easy. Quote, wells were dried up, tanks were drained to mud, the hills were leveled by the march of this army. The way over the mountains is like the way to Yama, which means death. There are waterfalls in some places and in others where water is scarce. The Mughal army faced rain, sleet, snow, and continuing battles with Kashmiri leaders, Chak leaders, until the annexure of Kashmir as part of the Mughal Empire, shown in the map on the left. And so this map is based upon a Mughal text, the Akbarnama, and its reference to different places within the valley and delineated as roughly having this extent. 3 years later, when Akbar himself came with a larger entourage, they were awestruck by what they encountered. The initial water observations and experiences were richly recorded in a multi-volume history called the Akbarnama, or History of Akbar. And the painting on the right is a scene where the Akbarnama is being presented to the king. Its author, Abul Fazl, asked, what shall I write of the fountains, trees, and flowers of this place, the groves and blossoming flowers and melody of waterfalls, increased astonishment. And interestingly, the first recorded Mughal water garden was just an ephemeral project organized for a boat trip where they had new boats built and had flowers and on top of the boats and had something of a floating garden on the surface of the water. And that scene is not just a accidental one. It, in my mind, harkens back to Akbar's father Humayun, who, when he first became king in Agra, organized a floating garden barge down the river Yamuna at Agra. They're repeating their own history in this new geographic context. Well, what's significant in the Akbarnama is that it's the Kashmir as a region of all of the regions of northern India in the Mughal Empire gets the longest description by far, and with many, many observations about its waters. Both qualitatively, its streams were sweet to the taste, waterfalls, music to the ears, and so on. But then lists of what Abul Fazl, the author, wrote of as water wonders, a long list of scores of springs, waterfalls, pools, and streams. He may have drawn in part upon the Nilamata Purana, which lists over 500 springs associated with Naga spirits who offered protection to the pious at these auspicious places. He mentioned, but did not dwell too much on the most famous of these springs at Veranog. At that site was where the god Shiva had struck his trident into the ground, trident being 1 vitasti in width, that allowed his consort, pure Parvati, to flow out and purify the land, and hence its identity as the origin of the river. This striking with the trident and the flowing of the waters therefrom to purify the land. This became a sacred place or origin, and we'll see that this becomes then significant in the Mughal context as well. Additionally, Abul Fazl mentioned the floating gardens on Dal Lake, which amazed them as to how the vegetation cover and the ways in which that was transformed into a productive landscape of cultivation on gardens that filled much of the lake's surface. He mentioned sacred confluence between rivers Jhelum and Sindh that were enhanced by a grove, a large grove of chinar trees, the oriental plane tree, like our sycamore. And whereas many of the regional descriptions, provincial descriptions, focus on land revenue and all the different revenue data, that's treated very briefly in Kashmir. The author then shifts to the kings of Kashmir and then to the selected legends that he drew from the translation of the Raja Tarangini Sanskrit chronicle, The Rivers of Kings, some 4 centuries plus before his own writing, to tell some of the stories of the valley. And foremost among them, of course, was its origin story, where the vast lake that inundated the valley and was dominated by an evil water demon was drained out by divine intervention that created the land of Kashmir and the presence of its Naga different spring sites. Akbar's own building projects, however, didn't involve any gardens. So there's all of this textual richness becomes a literary foundation for what would follow. Akbar himself focuses on the construction of the fortification of the Hari Parbat Hill, creating something of a more military site for the what would become the rule of the valley in the Mughal by the Mughal dynasty that followed. But I guess the point that I'd like to stress here is that nowhere else in Mughal literature does one find such a rich compilation of water stories as in this Akbarnama account of Kashmir. And so it sets the stage and then is really drawn upon by those who follow Akbar, his son and successor, Jahangir, and Jahangir's wife, Nur Jahan. Those projects will be in the upper Jhelum Basin. We said the Jhelum is flowing in this direction at Veranog and Achabal Springs. These are the 2 examples we'll focus on. Jahangir himself wrote, "If I were to describe Kashmir, its description would fill volumes. Its beautiful waterfalls are beyond description. Its flowing waters and springs are beyond number. He repeated the incorrect view that the Jhelum originated at Viranog and that it flowed through the city, past the Baramulla, down through the mountains, and ultimately to Punjab, in effect reciting that same historical river narrative of his ancestor Timur many generations before. Like his father, he appropriated culturally significant places for the water projects that he undertook. And so this iconic uh, water garden at Viranog that Jahangir kind of appropriated and also then shaped in various ways was the very site, the most sacred site of the origin of the Jhelum River that for many, many centuries before had been held by the people of the and culture of the valley. So there was no accident that he's selecting this place to establish a Mughal garden site of his own making. Here's how he describes it. The source of the Behat, which is Persian for Jhelum, is a spring in Kashmir called Viranog. In Hindi language, Viranog means a snake. And apparently there was once a great serpent in this place. This is kind of a very superficial perspective, but nevertheless, during my father's lifetime, I went twice to visit this spring. There's an octagonal pool, approximately 20 by 20 Ls, just yards, and there are traces of an ascetics temple in the vicinity with stone chambers and numerous caves. The water of this spring is extremely pure, although the depth cannot be estimated. If a poppy seed is thrown in, it can be clearly seen until it hits the bottom. Since I had heard that the depth of the spring was over a man's head, I told him to throw a rope in with a stone tied to it. When it was measured, it turned out it was no more than 1.5 times the height of a man. After my accession, I ordered the perimeter of the spring encased in stone, a garden made round it, straight waterways made, and porticos and chambers constructed around the spring. So far from engaging with the spiritual aspects of springs and nagas, even to the limited extent that the Akbarnama had, Jahangir focused on the pool's jointly visual, territorial, and empirical characteristics. And in these slides that will follow, I have a plan of each of the gardens. A red arrow will depict the direction of view that you'll see, the octagonal pool here, the long water channel here, and then usually the patron and the person commissioning the work on the right-hand side. Additionally, what's significant about his account is he gives the first dimensioned account of a Mughal garden in his memoirs. He describes very specifically that the octagonal pool was 42 cubits wide. 42 cubits is 40 Ls, but that's exactly twice the original size that he said the pool was. So he either doubled its width or didn't get it right the first time. But he did describe the central water channel that he built as being 180 Ls at yards, roughly, long. Now, when we compare those, take those Mughal units of measurement and turn them into meters, we find that that only extends for half the garden. Moreover, he said the channel was 4 Ls wide. When we measure the existing width today, we see that it's 6. Well, interestingly, it's well known that his son, Shah Jahan, revised the garden design, but this type of analysis of the field conditions tells us exactly how he modified it and how much, effectively doubling the length and scale of the garden water channel. Now, in addition to this extraordinarily significant project at Viranog, Jahangir's wife and queen Nur Jahan undertook a project a significant project at the springs at Archibald. And Noor Jahan, you probably know that your colleague, Professor Ruby Lal at Emory, has written the biography of Noor Jahan, and much of what I'll say kind of draws upon that. We don't have a painting of Noor Jahan in that context, but the painting on the right is said to portray Noor Jahan hosting Jahangir and Prince Khurram in a garden. If correct, she's not just hosting them, she commissioned and owned gardens. She had her own treasury, she had armed factions that followed her. She was the de facto ruler of the empire in Jahangir's later years. Thus, her water garden at Achabal stands on a par with that of Jahangir at Viranag. And what's significant at this garden is the power of its water spring. And anyone who's looked into a flowing spring that is got a very high rate of discharge can sense that power of the subterranean flow of water up to the water surface. It's just overwhelming in experience, as we see in the upper right hand image at the terminus of the garden. But what Nur Jahan established in this garden was a hierarchy of waterworks that proceed from a lower terrace that had some 9 fountains, a 3 by 3 array of fountains, up to a middle terrace for like a reception garden with 5 by 5 array of 25 fountains. And the uppermost gardens, that of her the Zenana or women's garden had 2 pools with 25 fountains each for 50 fountain type of garden that accepted the waters of the spring as it flowed out into the garden, and perhaps had some stilling effect as well as extraordinary display. But that hierarchical structure of waterworks is established in Noor Jahan's gardens, and they reflect her very keen sense of and astute sense of power and how it worked both in politics but also in the water realm. Thus, the Mughal water gardens of Kashmir really begin with Jahangir and Nur Jahan and these types of what I'll call spring gardens. Just 2 examples. There are others, and in addition, one that's named for Nur Jahan that even Akbar had mentioned in the Hari Parbat fort that Ebba Koch has identified. But it's call a foundation for what would follow, but that follow would take new forms in the context of Dal Lake and the gardens that we saw surrounding that on the shawl that was shown earlier in the talk. And the 2 of these that stand out, Shalimar Bagh and Nisat Bagh, were some of the 2 first 2 and the greatest 2 lake gardens that were designed and built in the Dal Lake context. Shah Jahan had visited Kashmir 4 times following his accession in 1627. And his historians, just like in the Akbarnama, his historians, one of the first things they list is there are 26 gardens in Kashmir, in Srinagar. And they mention something about their water context. This just got real salience in dynastic histories. They wrote, on the east side of the city is a lake they call Dal. It's surrounded by a collection of gardens studded with numerous villas. Diverse sorts of plants vegetate under the water, which is of the most pellucid clearness, and expand their variegated blossoms on its surface. The lake also contains some lovely islands. Although in the most romantic spots, the water is clothed with sweet leaves and flowers of the charbagh, by means of constant traffic of boats, and channels have been opened through the vegetation. The crystal brilliance of the water in these channels, the vegetation that is clearly visible below, and the blossoms that flower on both sides are enough to bewilder the gaze. And this last line conveys this dazzling aesthetic experience of lake water and aquatic vegetation. And if one's asking what it means to conserve the water experience of a place, one would go to a passage like that and ask, how can that be sustained and and realized and um, in the experience of those who follow. Uh, Almost all the pleasant places, they wrote, of recreation around the city of Kashmir can be visited by boats, as they're all on the margin of Dal Lake or on the banks of the River Jhelum. Now, I don't have time to do justice to these accounts and particularly the description of the lake water and its quality and its livelihoods, or the concerns now about both of them. And there's a wonderful forthcoming book later this month called Floating Economies on Dal Lake and its cultural ecology that I think others would enjoy greatly. The first garden, Shalimar Bagh, actually starts out with the name Farabaksh, means delightful. And the construction of a very unusual water channel that led through the wetlands on the lake's margin up to the terrace of the garden. So boats would come through the water channel on the lake's edge to arrive at the garden. That channel extended for almost 1,000 yards beyond the garden to the lake. The next stage occurs later, after 1634, when Shah Jahan, as the new um, king, orders the construction of an upper garden called Fezbaksh, immediately above the Farabaksh, and there to be two identically sized square gardens, fourfold in layout, but terraced, so they're quite different from the fourfold on a flat surface. And they're about 300 yards gauze in dimension. So imagine 300 yards on a size. These are monumental places. And so too are their central water bodies. This water channel is now 10 gauze wide. That's about 30 feet or so. It's more than double the width of any Mughal garden water channel up to this point. So the scaling up of waterworks is happening with these gardens in particular. Again, the pools are hierarchically sized. From the top of the garden, a 15 by 15 fountain array at the top, and then scaling down level by level, hierarchically sized in social as well as physical terms. Now, interestingly, a modern hydrologist with the Central Groundwater Board has prepared a technical report on the hydraulic system. This is where we get into some of these practical, call them jointly practical and scientific concerns, because the original source of water that would have come from a canal from the adjacent stream is no longer available. As a result, the garden today is served by large pumps down at the base of the slope, drawing upon the lake groundwater, pumping them up through 12-inch diameter cast iron pipes to the top to flow back down through the system by gravity. This is an enormous amount of energy and water to be conveyed in this fashion. And in addition, the irrigation system, not functioning in the traditional way, but has its own pumping and piping system with 2 to 3 inch diameter pipes. So the whole system is being kind of renewed in using modern technologies, but not necessarily the most efficient that might be possible, or that's kind of taking into account these volumes are really quite high. So the hydrologist estimated a flow of 0.4 cubic meters per second. That corresponds to 1,400 cubic meters per hour. That's about the amount by current Indian standards that 11,000 urban residents who have about 135 liters per capita per day would require. So for 1 hour of operation, that might serve 11,000 residents. So it has to be done as efficiently as possible. And there's lots of ways to move towards that type of efficiency. So let's take a look at the water budget for Kashmir. As Jahangir said, water is plentiful here. The rainfall shown here in a water budget diagram, monthly water budget diagram, shows that the surplus, the rainfall exceeds the evapotranspiration water requirements of plants in the valley. So there is a period of surplus, and it's also a period of scarcity. So the whole challenge here is to store the surplus for use during a time of scarcity, and you don't need any supplemental water supply to do that. It's challenging to do because the actual daily picture is one of periods of brief surplus and kind of enduring um, evaporation and transpiration by plants. But this can be all addressed quite readily with the kinds of soil moisture sensors and drip and metering and irrigation controllers. And it just so happens that the colleagues, Dr. Latif, the uh, agrometeorologist at the university, is their weather station is immediately adjacent to the Shalimar Garden. Now, there's potential here to combine this type of modern water technology with traditional irrigation systems. Let's go 2.5 kilometers south to the Nishad Bog. And the key thing here is that Asif Khan is the Grand Vizier or advisor to Shah Jahan. He is also the brother of Nur Jahan and thus, I guess, an uncle-in-law. And he's also the father-in-law of Shah Jahan. His daughter Mumtaz Mahal is the woman for whom the Taj Mahal is built. So these two men are connected on a very close level. And Asif Khan is granted the ability and the land to build a garden of his own, which we see here in this slide from the lake. And the immediate difference that you'll notice is that instead of a long water channel to reach the garden, this has a water landing. So you bring your boat up and drop off your occupants. They would be very impressed by this water cascade and abshar, and then proceed to walk up the um, terraces of the garden, level by level, until they reached the point where they were um, received. We also see in the contour map here that this is a fascinating case where the land has been sculpted in order to create the spine of this narrower water garden by excavation here and filling in the center to get this terrace cascade to work as it was originally envisioned. As in Shalimar Bog, the pools and fountains are hierarchically structured. And this garden, perhaps, even though its waterworks are less grand, has a water axis that's visually extraordinary, linking the terracing and the channels of the garden itself with Lake Dal beyond, a bridge within the lake, and the mountains beyond. Now, interestingly, the hydraulic report for Nishad Bog estimates a lower discharge than for Shalimar Bog, in part because the channel is smaller, but also because they're taking water from the channel to irrigate some of the side flanking terraces and beds. And so Nishad Bog, in many ways, presents a closer approximation to the Mughal system of garden hydraulics and water management than Shalimar. And there's something to be learned in that for the adjustment of other historic gardens in the valley and other regions. Well, this accomplishment notwithstanding, At about the time of its completion, 1645, and while the Mughal entourage is traveling to yet another garden by boat, a massive storm caused flooding that destroyed some 4,000 houses along the banks of the Jhelum River and Dal Lake. They also destroyed the Kharif crop, which contributed to a horrific famine. So this is 1645, a flood and famine connected with one another. It brings to mind the most recent catastrophic flooding, 2014. And some historical hydrologists have reconstructed the frequency of flood events and uh, associated storm events in the valley, and found that they have a recurrence interval, at least in the Mughal period, of some 13 years. Every 13 years or so, you would have major disasters. And the Mughal relief measures have been assessed as really being of an expedient nature. They would include emergency cash disbursement, public food kitchens, short-term revenue remissions, rather than long-term structural reforms that would protect against this kind of devastation. And yet there's still a lot to be learned about just that type of ways in which storm hazards and hydroclimatic hazards can be mitigated. And the vulnerable, because the gardens are both vulnerable, but they're also frequently resilient to such extreme events. Let's go to the last gardens in this series, and mindful of the time, we have two more gardens, and they really take us to a new chapter. These involve the Chashma Shahi and Peri Mahal gardens, commissioned by Princess Jahanara Begum and her brother Dara Shukla. Both their father is Shah Jahan. They're going to differ in form, but even more so in meaning than those discussed thus far. These two hill slope gardens stand out because they're set on promontories on the hill slope here, where there's a spring, and overlooking then the Dal Lake beyond. And in effect, then, they're able to connect the type of spring gardens that we talked about in Verinag and Achabal with the Dal lakefront gardens of Shalimar and Nishat Bagh, and get some kind of a synthesis, albeit in a much smaller and more complex ways. Beyond that, though, and I think this is the more significant aspect of these gardens, is that they're associated with the commitments of these two figures in the Mughal world to the Sufi tradition, and had that orientation before coming to uh, Kashmir. But during a 1640 trip, um, they become connected with a Sufi saint by the name of Mullah Shah Badakshi, known in Kashmir as Mullah Okund. And he was of the Qadriya order, and his pier was located in Lahore, where Dara Shukla and Jahanar would have first been kind of aware of this Sufi order. And when they come to Kashmir, they seek to um, follow Mullah Shah Badakshi as their peer. Portrait of the saint is shown here in the middle, aptly on a blank background, free from the types of attachments to this world that would otherwise be kind of prominent. Now, we'd say free, but not entirely so, as we'll see. One Sufi, a great Sufi saint, Nizamuddin Auli in Delhi, said, "What do I have to do with gardens? None of our people have ever been associated with this." Well, here we'll see a case where the saint becomes associated with the gardens and their springs. As part of their devotion to the Sufi peer, Dara Shukla and Jahanara Begum commissioned some building projects. And Jahanara Begum reportedly called one of the springs that they were exploring on the hillside the Chashma-i Shahi. Now that's often Shahi, can refer to ruler or king, but some interpretations recently have said, well, maybe it's a reference to the saint, Mullah Shah, Mullah Shahi. And Mullah Shah himself is said to have suggested that really the name of the spring should be Chashma-e-Sahibia. And that's been interpreted as a possible reference to the companions of the prophet. So they're getting an association with peers and prophets. But alternatively, one could also think that these two figures of the heir apparent to the throne, Dara Shah, Dara Shukka, and Jahanara Begum, kind of the elder sister and confidant of Shah Jahan, uh, her she was often terms referred to as a sahibia. So Shahi and Sahibia, the two springs, may have referred to these two figures as well. This is all speculative, but wonderfully type of speculation. At the base of the stairs, you'll see we're going to be proceeding up along a flight of stairs. And as soon as one arrives near the top, you get the framing of this view, both of the long view of the hilltop and the midterm view of a water chute down which water is rippling and flowing, and kind of just a wonderfully delightful and uh, kind of unbelievably high. These are common at a lower elevation, but this one's flowing over a long, long distance. And note how narrow the channel is. Down at the base, it's only 1 gauze, 1 yard wide. It's reverting back to the type of scale of the early Mughal gardens. And perhaps as one approaches the spring house itself, one starts to realize that this place is different. The tank and fountains on this level are the same size as those in the lower level, and perhaps more in accord with Jahanara Begum's more spiritual philosophy. This shift away from a hierarchical structure of the complex might be reflected in the kind of philosophy of the garden and its waterworks themselves. We'll turn now to Dara Shukka's final project, the Peri Mahal complex, a terraced garden with very tall masonry walls between the 6 terraces that step down the spur of a hillside. Again, there's speculation. Is it Peri Mahal, which means fairy palace, or Pir Mahal, named after his peer or spiritual leader, uh, Mullah Shah? This is again speculative play with names, which is wonderful to think about, but it's hard to tell. Now, at this garden, though, its spring has dried up. And the drying up of that spring leads one to ask, well, why? What happened? And what might happen in ways this kind of spiritual gathering that this garden was created for? It was meant to be it had a library. It was a place for spiritual retreat and also for astronomical study. All of the classical qualities of Islamic intellectual life vis-a-vis more pleasure palaces that were meant to be embodied here, but it has not been sustained in water terms. Why not? Well, it leads one to ask, well, what about the future of other places, and what happens when climate change starts to alter snow cover and uh, hydrogeology and spring flows in the valley? And for that, it's possible to look at the historical reconstruction, both through tree ring analysis, but here through observational data. So yes, indeed, temperatures are warming. And even though precipitation is also increasing, its variability is increasing. So the climatic future of the valley needs to be studied extraordinarily closely to know how these uh, uh, really quite sensitive water systems might respond and adjust, and how human society might adapt and mitigate as well. Well, from a kind of longer perspective beyond the period in which Mughal um, uh, rulers were coming up to Kashmir on a regular basis, and after their attention really is shifting southward in the latter part of the 17th century, is nevertheless the fact that the projects that they undertook in their capital cities, in Lahore, in Delhi, in Agra, and down below in Aurangabad as it becomes a later capital, all of them have the scale, and this is the garden in Lahore, influenced, in my view, by the projects that were initiated in Kashmir. And so that scale of water system that we see in places like the Taj Mahal and in Lahore Fort and in the Shah Jahanabad or Old Delhi are all kind of reflecting the capabilities that were established initially in Kashmir, and then the type of engineering that was required to make that possible down in the plains, which was accomplished through usually through combinations of long distance canals and batteries of wells, Persian wheels and other types of draw wells. And one can ask, as the kind of the history of the Mughal Empire itself declines, there's an extraordinary uh, afterlife of Mughal gardens and continuing life of Kashmiri water systems that is a separate subject of study, you know, an enormous one to consider. But to ask, well, you know, what could come next? What types of studies could come out of this type of comparison between the early Mughal gardens, the Kashmiri gardens, the later gardens, and their practical as well as their historical significance. And some years ago at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, we organized a 3 Shalimars project, one that would compare the Shalimar Bagh Srinagar with the garden of the same name in Delhi and the same name in Lahore. So the 3 Shalimar Gardens project, which a whole bunch of colleagues from each center participated in, would enable the exchange of conservation expertise and the comparison across the very different contexts in which conservation is occurring in these 3 regions today, and hopefully have that type of exchange be one of value to all. I think there's additional potential there. But when I'm thinking about more, uh, it is based on some in recent months and past year is based upon some questions that we're asking in the context of the Indus River Basin, largely, where we're saying that the water management at the river basin scale for all of the efforts to enhance and improve it, it's just not somehow modern approaches to water resources management are missing something, and some of the failures are reflect what's missing. In the Indus Basin context, we're asking what would it be like if you were to treat a large river basin as a garden, and or as a mosaic of gardens in which all of the care, in the best sense of gardening, that goes into a place and bringing out its values and balances as fully as one is able. If that were to be scaled up to the scale of a basin, and in this case, a basin renowned for its identity as a regional garden, filled with hundreds and hundreds of historical gardens and many, many thousands of places that were garden-like in spirit and quality, but um, that if all kind of woven together might offer a new and more promising approach. Well, that's what I wanted to share with you this evening. I'm enormously grateful to you for inviting me and would be happy to take any questions that folks might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I'm glad you're willing to take questions because there are already several in the Q&A. John Ellis is an architect in Brooklyn who is joining us, and he says, I have also heard that these gardens use visual, material, atmospheric, and acoustic techniques to dazzle and mystify observers. They were scenographically used for political purposes. Could you elaborate?
Okay, so yeah, on the two aspects of that question, the first was all of the performative um, ways. It's not so necessarily in this context, but I know, for example, of pavilions that would have huge rock boulders rolled around the tops of the pavilions to give the kind of sense of thunder. And there would almost be rainstorms where the water would pour off the roofs to give the simulation of being in a monsoon storm within a pavilion. So that performative aspect of gardens, John points out, is enormously important. And then secondly, I tried to really highlight some of the politics, both of garden construction and of the social types of politics that would have occurred in human interactions within gardens. And that is an enormously important theme. So thank you, John.
Another question is, was the technology needed for the waterworks developed by the Mughals, or did they import this knowledge?
A great question. So that in the Kashmiri context, since many of the gardens ran by gravity flow, the larger technologies of water supply were already present. There were many pre-Mughal canals and also wells. Now, the technology of fountains I know less about, and when the kind of piped water systems and pressure driven fountains were developed, that I'm less familiar with the kind of history of that technology, but in the Kashmir context, I think I'd add one additional type of technological knowledge which concerns springs and the management of springs and the ways in which spring flows would be captured and protected traditionally. And that would be knowledge that the Mughals would have much less expertise in. They tended to adapt technologies more than innovate as great water scientists down in the plains, but their adaptations were pretty impressive.
And another question, Mohammed Chakaki says that he's intrigued by the notion of a compressed geography or territory into a garden and the implications around power and politics. Is there an analogous move from garden out to territory landscape? And if so, what is learned within the scale of garden that is then applied at larger scales, either by Mughal rulers historically or garden goers today?
Wow, thank you, Mohammed.
Did you get that?
yeah, sure. I know Mohammed. That's the type of question he would ask. And it's a terrific one because you can make the case for the kind of this compression and miniaturization pretty clearly. And then the question of how it scales up and outwards. And that, I think, was part of the purpose, was that in a world of extraordinary uncertainties and unfamiliarity, the garden became a very a well-ordered place from which to try to rule and from which to try to extend rule out to scale. So how would you then see that scaling happen in a larger, call it territorial context? Well, I think one place that I would look and need to try to see how strongly the case can be made is in precisely the administrative geography of the Mughal Empire. So they developed, really with some sultanate foundations, a whole hierarchy of administrative units that were parganas at a medium scale. So there's the villages at the smallest scale, then the parganas and larger tehsils, and then larger subas or provinces. and that scaling of administrative territories could be perhaps made analogous with some of the scaling that was happening within gardens, but that's much more in a political economic way than a infrastructural way. For infrastructure, I'd look to the types of very regular siting of caravanserais along new highways. So that along a highway, there would be provision made for continuous tree plantings and wells for travelers and travelers' inns and hammams, and that kind of administrative or other infrastructural systems would be the scaling out of garden type of philosophy. These are both hypotheses. That's how I would go at it if I had the time.
David Blumenthal asks, is there a difference between Hindu and Muslim perceptions of the water resources?
Yeah, I think the answer will be yes, and also a confluence of them too. So that you'll have, as I think I mentioned, these springs associated with Nagas. These were pilgrimage sites. So a Hindu visitor would go as a pilgrim to these sites and then perform devotions, and with the hope of having some beneficent, favorable omen for what one's concerns and hopes and prayers might be. In the Muslim context, and I won't use the Mughal kind of ruler type of here, but the more the uh, population and then the types of local spiritual leaders like a Sufi saints and so on, they too would go to these water places as places of purity and ritual purity and purification associated with prayers and so on. So some of the rituals would be different, but some of the spiritual aspects would be kind of woven together in extraordinary ways. Sometimes they would come into conflict with one another. I want to overstate the confluence, but there certainly was a kind of a, a co-occupation of significant water places, both at springs and then in the extraordinary boat traffic. And boats today, houseboats and market gardeners and fisher people are all of different communities, different Muslim communities at the present time on Dal Lake, but they're different, and so they both co-occupy and coexist, but also sometimes conflict with one another. So it's an amazing story, and it's a great question. But the tendency to divide into two categories that themselves were enormously diverse should be avoided.
I can't thank you enough for being with us tonight and taking us on this remarkable journey, especially at a time when we can't travel there. It's been absolutely fabulous, and it's wonderful to have you. Thank you so much.
Well, and thank you all. I really appreciate it, and I was able to learn a lot by preparing. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for joining us. I hope you'll take a look at the carlos.emory.edu calendar. We have other programs coming up. This Sunday is a program on the relationship between Islam and coffee. Soon, Didi Ruggles will be joining us to speak about modern Islamic gardens. So we have lots of wonderful programs coming up, and we hope you'll join us again. Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.